Shabbat Shalom. And a preliminary Shana Tova. It's just around the corner, so I don't feel like I'm shortchanging Shabbat too much by extending that greeting. We are going to have lots of time together over the next month. And we are very fortunate to have our guest to lead us in so many of our services. But some of the things that we do are new, and some of them are very old. In particular, one of the things that often gets overlooked as being important and very ancient is the recitation, the chanting of the Haftarot, of the selections taken from the Nevi'im, from the prophets. This is a part of our service that goes back thousands of years, and yet many people, when it comes time for the Haftarah, because there were no aliyot, there's no up and there's no down, there's no beginning and end and all the different breaks, like there are of the Torah service, many people, I hate to say it, maybe take a little bit of a nap. Maybe they tune out a little bit. Maybe because of the poetry of the Haftarot, it's hard to always find the connection. Now, classically, how is it that the Haftarot were chosen? Well, they were chosen primarily to match the theme of the Torah reading for that week. So if you are in Bereshit, you have a Haftarah that matches the theme of creation. If you are in Noach, you have a Haftarah that matches the theme of the story of Noah, and so on throughout the year. But there are a few exceptions. Obviously, holidays do not follow the natural cycle of the Torah portions, and therefore they receive their own special Haftarot. And there were also special announcement Haftarot. The preliminary Haftarot that come before Purim, that become before Pesach, and so on. But the longest single chain of deviant Haftarot that do not follow the pattern of the normal cycle of Torah portions, stretches for 10 weeks. And we are just this week at its end. It is not coincidental that it ends right before Rosh Hashanah. But does anybody remember where that 10-week cycle began? In Av. Actually, just before the month of Av. It began 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av, before the commemoration of the 9th of Av, when we commemorate the largest bundle of catastrophes that have befallen our people over the millennia, all on that day of Tisha B'Av. For 3 weeks before that, we read special Haftarot of criticism, of admonition, to use the fancy English, where the prophets unleash upon us. And they detail our crimes, our sins, and all of the problems that led to the early destruction of the first temple in particular. And then following Tisha B'Av, for the 7 weeks that come later, 10 minus 3 is 7, I can do that math even in my head, the theme changes radically. The theme goes from criticism to one of consolation, of hope, of uplift, of celebration. For 7 weeks, we recite these Haftarot one after another to give us an additional sense of hope and optimism for the future. It makes for a very interesting cycle going through this 10 weeks, and especially ending up with that final one being right before Rosh Hashanah, which again is not coincidental. This is trying to show us something very deep and very significant about Judaism, of the balance of how we view the world. When you look out at the world, generally speaking, people tend to take one or two positions. One, they look at the world as being fundamentally messed up. The world is terrible, people are terrible, it always has been terrible, it always will be terrible. Let's just acknowledge it, notice all the problems that are there, and we can lament, weep, cry, and mourn for the sorry state of the world. Many other people look out at the world and they say, well, hold on a second. God created this world. He created this beautiful existence, and each of us are in it. And that in and of itself is a blessing that has to be appreciated and rejoiced each and every day. And problems, let's focus on what is good, on what is bright, and what is coming that can be better than what has been before. This eternal optimism. And Judaism is a dance between these two extremes. Judaism recognizes these two attitudes that pull us in opposite directions. And Judaism tells us you need both, but you need the right balance. You need the right ratio between them. For when it gets out of balance, things go very bad indeed. There is a story that comes from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, where Rabbi Joshua notices that many of the people of the community have begun to take upon themselves new strictures, new restrictions, new changes to how they are living as a form of commemoration for the destruction of the Second Temple. They say, there in Jerusalem we offered meat and wine, and now the temple is in ruins. How can we sit down to our tables and eat meat and wine and rejoice when the temple is still destroyed? And so we will never touch meat or wine again. Rabbi Joshua says, that's an interesting idea. So you're saying anything that was done with joy at the temple, now you shouldn't do, because we don't deserve to have happiness with the temple in ruins. Well, we used to often offer up grain offerings. The mincha service in particular was mostly a grain offering. So by your logic, I guess that means that all the bread, all the grains, off the table. And the people said, you're right, absolutely, no more. And this was long before this was considered a no-carb diet. This was a major, major change of life. Bread was indeed the staff of life, but they were willing to show their pain and suffering to give up even bread in commemoration of the temple. And he said, well, we also used to offer bikurim, the first fruits, at the altar of Jerusalem. And the people said, then we will only eat fruits and vegetables that were not offered as part of the bikurim offerings. We will not partake of the beautiful bounty of the land that was specially singled out by God for its celebration. Rabbi Yoshua says, because rabbis are always pushy and go a little bit extra, he said, but there also used to be a special water sacrifice at the time of Sukkot. At that, the people shut up, because they recognized that you can't not drink and live. To give up everything that had been associated with the temple would be to no longer be alive. And that was not what God was calling us to do. And Rabbi Joshua summed it up very beautifully. He said, look, to not mourn at all is impossible. Of course, we are going to grieve. We look out at the world and we see that there is still so much pain, so much suffering. And even in our own day, we have been bitterly reminded of how many problems there are left to solve in our world. But to grieve over much is also impossible. For we were not created to merely wither and die in misery and pain and grief. We must also be able to celebrate and find joy. And so we explained that yes, we would have certain limitations. When we paint our house, we would leave a little part undone. When we bake jewelry, we would leave a setting unfilled by the stone. We would do other zechers and other reminders of the fact that the world was not perfect, so that we would never completely forget, even when we were joyous, even when we were celebrating, that the world was just that little bit extra broken. But on the other side as well, we could never mourn too much. Tisha B'Av comes only once a year. Shabbat comes 52 times a year. The holidays that are joyous far outnumber the holidays that are somber. And this, when we look at our ratio of haftarot, is a good idea. 3, where we reflect negatively. 7, where we reflect with optimism. No one should mourn more than that. Every time you have a negative thought, a despair, a moment of feeling like the world is going to be completely overrun, that there is no hope, counter it with at least 2 positive ideas. Find 2 things that counteract that, and recognize that the world was not made for despair, the world was made for joy. And yes, sometimes that can be hard. We have been fed a steady diet for hundreds and hundreds of years by people who want us to despair, by people who want us to think that the world is hopeless, by people who want everyone to give up hope and just let it be. But that is not our way. Our way is to say, yes, this is wrong, this is bad, but you know what? We have things that are good and bright and beautiful and wonderful, and we will celebrate those double portioned compared to those that are bad. And after our celebration, Then we'll roll up our sleeves and we'll take care of the bad parts too. This ratio of 2 to 1 is a good way to start. But you can go higher than that. You can get all the way up to 99.9% optimistic, 99% joyous, 99% celebratory. But do remember to keep that little bit unfinished, that little bit undone, to recognize that as happy as we can be at a moment, that the world is not quite the way it should be. Somewhere between 99 and 66%. Aim for that, for your measure of happiness versus frustration. And you'll find that the world will get a little better, and you'll be the cause of it. Shabbat Shalom.